You are listening to Rootbound, a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside.
Plant yourself down and pop in your earbuds for your favorite podcast, Rootbound, kind of a big dill.
Thank you for joining me on another episode of Rootbound. My name is Steve. And hey, trees are awesome, right? I mean, yeah, trees. I haven't talked too much about trees on this podcast, but today we're going to talk about a tree. And so I thought at the beginning of the show, I might go over some of the basic anatomy of a tree trunk, which is actually pretty complicated. And I had to refresh my memory and even learn a few new things today. And so maybe the same can happen for you. So the trunk of a tree is made up of 5 primary layers. The first one is one that we're all aware of. That is the bark. That's the stuff you see. It's on the outside, the outermost layer of the tree trunk. And the bark is essentially the armor for the tree. It's kind of like the skin. It protects the tree. It keeps bad stuff from getting into the tree. That is the bark. It's also known as the outer bark because the next layer is the inner bark. And the inner bark is also known as the phloem or phloem. I'm not quite sure on that pronunciation. But this is a thin layer, and this layer moves the products of photosynthesis from the leaves through the rest of the tree. And as phloem gets older, it becomes outer bark. So the inner bark, the phloem, when it gets older, it becomes the bark. The next layer is really interesting. It's a very thin layer, and it's called the cambrium. And this layer is where tree growth comes from. And the cambrium is a layer of undifferentiated cells that can either become phloem and then eventually bark if they move towards the outer layers of the tree, or they can become the next layer, which is the sapwood. And the sapwood is the layer of the tree that transports water from the ground up to the rest of the tree. So that's kind of interesting, like 2 different parts. The phloem moves the stuff that is made by the leaves from photosynthesis down through the tree, and the sapwood moves water and other nutrients from the earth up the tree. And as sapwood gets older, it hardens and dies back, and it becomes the final layer of the tree, which is the heartwood. And this is actually the majority of a tree's mass. It is the wood, and it is primarily dead material in the middle of the tree trunk, and it provides the structural integrity of the tree. And I liken it kind of like bone, right? Bone is not like a live material in your body, but it is the solid structural integrity, and that is the heartwood. So those are the 5 layers of a tree. Before we get started, I just want to give a little bit of a heads up that the last section of this podcast might be a little bit of a bummer. So if you're not ready to have a bummer today, feel free to hold this episode for another time. It's super interesting content. I think we should all learn it, but it is a little bit of a bummer. So be prepared. But let's welcome on our guest to the show today.
Although we commonly consider the animal kingdom as of greater importance, it is well to remember that plants are the ultimate source of food for all forms of animal life.
Hey, Timo.
Hey, Steve. Hi.
How's it going?
It's going really well, thanks. Yeah, I had a good day, and nice to be talking to you.
Yeah, same with you. Do you have a plant to share with us today?
I do have a plant to share. The plant I would like to share and talk about is comfrey.
Oh, that's very exciting because comfrey is a plant that I know the name of, but I literally know nothing about, and I've probably seen it, but I don't know what it looks like. And so I'm excited to learn about comfrey from you today.
That's great, yeah. Well, like you said, I'm pretty sure you've seen it, because at one point, when I realized which plant this was, I realized that I've actually seen it around quite a bunch, but I didn't know what it was before. So, yeah. So let me talk about a little bit why I actually came across choosing this plant.
Yeah, please.
So it was a little personal story. I used to have two rabbits, and one of the rabbits jumped off the roof of the little house that they lived in
Oh,
and broke one of its legs.
oh no.
So yeah, it was a little bit sad. We had to go to the vet, and so the vet literally told us there wasn't very much we could do. We just would have to wait for it to heal and not let the rabbit move too much. So not let it, kind of keep it in a small place so it couldn't move too much. So at that point, I was like, oh, okay. I've just kind of been interested in healing plants for quite a while. So I just Googled the possibilities of healing plants, in this case, like for bone fractures or, for bone fractures. And that's how I came across Comfrey.
Interesting. And so it has a history of being. I think I've heard that, even though I said I don't know much about comfrey. I think that's one thing in my brain is that it is like a known medicinal herb, as well as like also used for like just a salad green is too. Am I correct about that?
Yes, that's right. Actually, it's been used. People have been eating it for quite some time. And I was back in the day. I was living with a person in the house I lived in, and she was like, "Yeah, of course, comfrey. There's like," she told me that's the queen of medicinal plants, and I was like, "Oh, okay."
Oh,
So I got more and more interested in the plant, and I. I myself, I went to Waldorf school, so I have a little bit of a connection to plants because we were taught quite a lot about plants, mostly though about trees and flowers, not medicinal plants. So, but I have a connection to that, and it's been something that I'm interested in for quite some time. So that's why I kind of started to dig into it, and so so
so the rabbit was okay.
the rabbit was fine after a while. Yeah, it was good. I didn't actually use the plant on the rabbit because I didn't really know. There were different like ideas how to like use it on the animal, but like it seemed to be quite complicated to actually do in practice. So I
I
didn't
see,
actually use it back in the day. Yeah,
but I'm glad that it did recover from the broken leg.
it did. Yeah,
Oh,
it
good.
did. Yeah, and it lived quite some time actually after
Oh,
that.
that's
Still,
great.
but the German word is actually Beinwell or Soldatenkraut, which is quite interesting.
Oh, interesting.
So
So wait. So okay, my German's a little rusty. It's been a while since I've lived in a German-speaking country, but like Bein means bone, right?
exactly, yeah. Well, Bein is like a leg, but it's actually
Oh, Bein. Yeah,
originally
leg. Yeah.
originally though it means bone actually, and so in English it's also another name for comfrey is knit bone or bone set.
Oh,
So
bone set. Yeah. Okay.
yeah, so it actually said it's like what the healing possibilities are is already in the word.
Interesting. And
Um,
the other word you said, which was soldaten, what was it? Kraut? It's like soldier's herb.
yeah, exactly. So it was probably used by soldiers back in the day, and I kind of when I did a little bit of research about the plant, it's actually been known for 2,000 years, so it's a long time. It's been used
Oh, wow.
as a medicinal plant and as a plant like you already suggested as a plant that people were eating too for a long, long time. I think it was first actually talked about in ancient Rome, even in the time of Nero. So yeah.
Oh, wow. So it's a plant that is, I imagine, is native to the European continent. Is that?
Yes, it's native to the European continent, but it's also in America, and so it's actually been well known in different countries. Yeah, it's kind of a plant that's all over the place once you start looking and find it.
I'm going to definitely have to look this up and start looking for it out here because I've heard that it's around. Like I said, my basic knowledge of it, I've heard it and that it's around, but I've never seen it. So have you like used it? Have you like eaten it? Have you used it for anything medicinal? What is your personal experience with it?
Yeah, I haven't actually eaten it because it's a bit of a topic also. Um, like a couple of years ago, well, I think it's quite a while ago actually. I think around 10 years ago, there was some research done on the plant, and they found some alkaloids in the plant that they suggested were actually dangerous for the human body.
Hmm.
So, although it's a healing plant, they suggested not to eat it anymore, and they just said that it's still okay to like use in small doses when you're like applying it to a wound or to like a specific place on your body. But yeah, so that's a little bit of a topic that I thought was quite interesting. So on one side, it's been used for like over 2,000 years, and then on the other side, you have like this new science come up, and they're like you have to be really careful with it, and especially if you're like pregnant or if you have liver problems, and yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing, and there's been somewhat of a theme on the show already about that. There's this interesting gray area between like what is edible or medicinal and what is not. In one episode, we talked about the famous, which I didn't know about this guy, even though I lived in Switzerland. And to say to listeners, Timo is in Switzerland as well.
Yes,
I used to
exactly.
live in Switzerland, but in the episode previous, we talked about the famous Swiss physician Paracelsus. Are you familiar with him?
Oh yes, of course.
Yeah.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
and I just learned about him recently, but he had the famous quote that essentially is the dose makes the poison, right? And it's not something is not necessarily poison, but it's how much
Yes,
of it you take and the way that it is administered. And so it's
yes,
an interesting gray area because I think it's very true. Things can be, potentially bad for you, but can also be quite good for you depending on how they're treated. And a few episodes ago, I talked about a plant called pokeweed here in the United States, which has a long history of being eaten as a green. But if you don't
hmm
cook it correctly, it is quite toxic. So it's
Oh
this.
yes,
But so like everyone, if you ask anybody, they'll say no, don't eat it. It is toxic. But yet people have been eating it for a very long time,
a
and
very long time,
and not okay.
exactly.
So it's this. I think this balance of really understanding the plant, which is I think part of my journey with this podcast is trying to understand plants more. Because yeah, you don't want to be the person who's not thinking about it and eats something and destroys your liver, but you also don't want to
Absolutely.
necessarily miss out on something that really can be quite tasty or useful. So yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with you on that point. And I also, when I was looking into the plant a little bit, I also learned that it was used during the famine in Ireland, in the 1840s. So it was like, during the potato famine, it was a plant that was eaten a lot in that time. And it was also used for feeding livestock. So, yeah.
Oh yeah, interesting. Do you ever see it around where you live? Is it a plant that you've like spotted just growing in the wild in that area of Switzerland?
Yeah, it's funny. I in the house I used to live in. I think you've actually been to the old farmhouse back in the
Yeah, I
day.
remember that place. Very cool
Yeah.
place.
So it was really there was a big plant, comfrey plant growing in the backyard, and they kind of like damp and grassy places or like along riversides or bogs along walls. And we had one of those growing right next to the old wall, and you kind of I mean they really start growing and also becoming more visible like from May to July, and they're a bit like they I think what's quite apparent about them is that they have these really large broad lance-shaped hairy leaves.
Mm-hmm.
That is something that really sticks out. It's a bit you can actually confuse it with foxglove quite easily, which is a bit tricky because foxglove is pretty poisonous as far as I
Mm-hmm.
know. But what makes it really clearly different from foxglove is the flowers. So that is something that is quite interesting to look out for. But there again, the flowers. I didn't know this too. I mean, the flowers that in the comfrey plant that was growing around just in our backyard always had white flowers. But I learned that they can also be pink, yellow, or blue, red, or purple. So
Oh wow, quite a variety.
quite a variety. And also about concerning the topic we were just talking about before. Apparently, if you want to use the comfrey for like food or for medicinal purposes, you should use the one with the white flowers. So this is also something I learned. I thought was pretty interesting.
Very interesting. Yeah, that's fascinating. Do you have any other fun facts or dazzling details about comfrey?
I do. One other personal experience, actually, I had it with it. Sometimes when I have back pain, I use this ointment or this cream. It's called Kita. I don't know if you know that. It's
No, I don't
something
know that one.
we can buy.
Kytta.
Exactly.
Kita.
Yeah, Kita. So, I've been using this for a long time. And one day I just kind of looked what's inside. And of course, it says Valvort Spinewell. So there's comfrey in this cream.
Oh, wow.
And it's one of the things that is said also that it can help like with muscle sprains and joint inflammation. Or I mean, I've been using it for backaches and it works. I mean, I didn't know it was in there, and I think it's great. So
That's really interesting. Huh, I wonder if I don't know if you looked up any science, if people have like determined what kind of compounds are responsible for its behavior. I mean, if you something maybe look up too.
Yeah, it's I haven't, this is kind of a bit out of like the things I know. So I know there's a whole variety in there, and but it's not something I know a lot about in detail. So
Yeah, well, perhaps I'll normally include some links when I post this podcast, so I'll look up some stuff like that because that's really interesting. And that's one thing I've also discovered is there's a lot of plants that have been known for a long time to have certain qualities, and I think this is a really
yeah,
interesting example that the name is like bone set or like making your bones
absolutely.
better but the the mechanisms for how they work can still be mysterious. One, because the research is hard and expensive, and also it's often very complicated. I've done a lot of research on that, so it's interesting to learn like what are those little secrets that we're just starting to maybe fully understand, even though we've known about them for, as you said, 2,000 years at
Yeah,
least.
totally. Yeah. And I think also like what I find interesting every time I like learn some details about a medicinal plant is there's a big difference between the leaves and the root, and this
Mm-hmm.
also seems to be the case with comfrey. So like the roots is also something that's been used apparently as it's been roasted as like a coffee substitute. And
Oh,
so the most alkaloids, also these alkaloids that are actually this topic that has been looked at, and people have been warning about it, is that most of them are actually in the root, but it's much less in the leaves.
okay.
So but I think also so like in this case for comfrey, the poultice that people have been making out of it was usually containing the roots and the leaves. But I think it's good to separate, those kind of different parts of the plant.
Yeah, that's
Um,
interesting. Actually, going back to that plant pokeweed I was talking about, which is a nice edible plant, but the root is the most toxic part, and the root, from
mhm.
what I've read, is just not edible. It is where it is mostly concentrated these toxins, but the leaves, if they're prepared correctly, can be edible. So yeah, that's quite interesting.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
what also you brought up reminds me of we talked about in episode 2 of the podcast about dandelion, and dandelion has also in the past the roasted dandelion root has been used as a coffee substitute as well.
That is true. Yeah, I've actually tasted that myself, and it's I like it. Yeah, it's pretty
Yeah,
good.
it's pretty good. I'd made it myself for the first time a couple years ago. I need to do it more. It's a little but of a process. So, when you just have the coffee beans, and it also doesn't have caffeine. So, yeah,
Nice. Oh, so you made it yourself. That's
yeah,
special.
yeah. Because I've
Yeah.
got a little yard here, and dandelions grow, quite readily. And they're the greens I love for dandelions, and also the root is interesting to use. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. Interesting. Another couple of things that I learned about the plant that I thought was interesting. It is apparently one of a selected few in the plant kingdom that are able to synthesize vitamin B12.
Oh, wow.
That
That's
is,
really fascinating.
I think that's pretty interesting. And so it seems to be like also some people were talking about it, that it's kind of a king of accumulator. So it's also it's also been it loves to be used as a fertilizer apparently. So in gardens, it's really enriches the soil with nitrogen, and gardeners seem to
Oh,
love that for that reason too.
those are two super fascinating facts. Because
Absolutely, yeah.
B12, if I'm remembering correctly, B12 is the one vitamin that um, most people get from meat, and it's harder to get as a vegetarian diet is B12, and you can get B12 from fermented foods.
Yes.
But the fact that the plant Comfrey has B12 as a plant is really interesting, and then the other one using it as a fertilizer, something I might try because that sounds really cool.
Yeah. Yeah. Apparently, it's really great for that. So yeah, if you have a garden, you should totally give it a shot.
Yeah, I'm going to look into that.
Yeah. So yeah, like I mean, I think this is one of the most interesting topics around the plant, is that it seems to be really a very important medicinal plant. And so yeah, the question is for me really like, how do you use it in a good way, so it doesn't harm the body, but actually can show its healing effects. And yeah, so this is something I'd like to look into more and understand more. So yeah.
Cool. Well, yeah, it's an excellent journey to be on, and something that, one of the reasons I started this podcast is to do that. So, yeah, thanks for joining and explaining about Comfrey. Is there anything else you've got written down in your notes there?
Um, yeah, one maybe interesting little topic that came up that I thought was interesting. It was also used in witchcraft.
Oh, interesting.
Absolutely. So apparently, it helped vanquish a ghost, but it was also often carried along for safety and good health while traveling when you're away from home.
Ah, okay.
So, I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, that is very interesting.
Just always look back and see how people have been using it, or what they came up with, what the ideas were behind it.
The greenfinch, so called from the color of its belly, is as large as a lark. It lays 4 or 5 eggs, builds its nest out of the plant called comfrey.
Well, do you mind if I share a plant with you?
I would love to hear what you would like to share. Yeah.
I was trying to choose a plant, and that's like the big challenge with this podcast is every episode I have to talk about a plant that somehow means something to me. And there's a lot there, but trying to choose a plant and choose a plant for who I'm going to talk to. And so I've been wanting to talk about this plant for a while, and unfortunately, it's a bit of a sad story. So I'm sorry to have a little bit of a bummer of a story, but it is really interesting, even though it is sad, and there is fortunately a bit of hope as well.
That's good.
But why this plant means something to me. I live in Northern Virginia, and a lot of the forests around here, and a lot of this part of the country, the whole kind of eastern, even from down south up into Canada, a lot of the forests are what are called mixed hardwood forests. So it's a bunch of different species: oak, maple, poplar, alder, things like that, kind of mixed throughout. And the other thing is very few like pine trees or spruce. And when you get further north or in certain areas, you'll have these forests that are majority, spruce or pine, and not many hardwoods. But most of the forests here are this mixed hardwood. So they have a bunch of different species of trees. But if you're hiking through almost any forest around here, and from what I've read, all around the country, you'll often notice very big trees that are just dead. And those trees are most likely, and if you learn the identification factors, are most likely either white ash or green ash, depending on where you are. Black ash, and ash is the plant I chose. It's ash, and in German it's Die Esche is what I looked up.
Yes, Esche.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah,
Esche, a kind of tree, and this is particularly white ash. Is Fraxinus is the Latin genus name, which I think in some European languages has roots of that, but in German apparently it's similar to ash. the two that I'm mostly talking about are Fraxinus americana and Fraxinus pennsylvanica, which are two native ash trees. So they're similar to ash trees in Europe, but they are native European or native American species. That name ash apparently comes from an old English word that is like esk, I guess. It's Aesc,
Mhm.
which is a word that also means spear. And I guess
Oh,
fraxinus also means spear in Latin, and that's because the ash tree is very strong but also flexible and makes a good spear, and so the
makes
words
sense.
became interchangeable. Um, I'll get to the sad part in a little bit about why you see them dead in the forest.
Mhm,
But
mhm.
just a little bit more facts about it. They grow mostly over the whole eastern North American continent, from down in like the swamps up into a lot of Canada, but mostly on the eastern side, not really over the Rockies.
Mhm.
Um, they grow up to 30 meters tall, so pretty big trees. Um, they have compound leaves, so when you look at a tree, you'll see a stem coming off of a big branch, and then there'll be leaves coming off in parallel from that stem, and then kind of one leaf on the end. And each set of those multiple leaves coming off is actually one leaf. So the way that
Mhm.
entire branch is attached to the stem is more like how a leaf is attached to a stem. So it's compound. It's a leaf that's made of many leaves,
Nice.
which
Yeah.
is the one way you can, if you see the leaves, you can tell it apart. The other thing it has is it has opposite branch structure. So most trees have alternate branch structure. So you'll have a side branch coming off a branch here, and the next one coming here. I'm showing Timo on the camera. You can't see this. They're alternating up the branch, whereas ash, they come out parallel from each other. They'll come out from the center stalk. The branches will come out exactly opposite each other. So that's one
Oh,
way that you can
interesting fact.
tell
Yeah.
the difference. There's some stuff about the bark which I'm not very good at of examining the bark of how you can tell the difference, but that's ash. It's a
Mhm.
very useful wood. It's been used one of the main woods used in baseball bats for a long time, or like
Oh,
tool
yeah.
handles. It's very good for tool handles. Um, the bowling alleys were made, though the wood on bowling alleys are made out of ash.
Right. Yeah.
It really makes a great veneer, so you can peel it to very thin layers. It's a very useful wood, and also, and this is the reason I wanted to talk about you, because you are a musician,
Mhm.
and ash is a very well known wood for guitars, particularly electric guitars, and
That's true.
particularly Fender guitars.
Exactly. I think I have my Telecaster. My Telecast definitely made of ash. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I was looking that up, and I guess I didn't realize that until recently. How like that's what made the Telecaster and the Stratocaster a thing was
Ah.
was Leo Fender using ash, and particularly a kind of ash they call swamp ash.
Oh, right.
And it is called swamp ash because this grows more in the south, where in the swamps, where part of the year the base of the tree is flooded, and then later the flooding goes away, and something about that being submerged in water for part of the year for over many years makes the wood have this particular property that's good for guitars.
Super interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so Jimmy Page played a ash guitar. Keith Richards played an ash guitar.
Yeah.
Springsteen plays an ash guitar. So it's a very it's like a big thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
But and we're going to kind of maybe get into the sad part now. I think it was 2020, Fender discontinued using ash
Okay.
in their guitars, and that's because we have a problem in the United States now, and it is a insect called the emerald ash borer.
Oh. Mhm.
And it is a little small green beetle, emerald shiny. It's kind of a beautiful bug. It's shiny
Mhm.
green,
Mhm.
and it will burrow into the bark of an ash and lay its eggs between the dead wood and the bark.
Mhm.
And then the little larvae eat that live, I forget the name of this material, but it's the stuff between the bark and the dead wood.
Mm.
It's like mostly where the living tissue in a tall tree is that part. And it eats that, and basically an ash borer can really just completely colonize an ash tree, and those little larvae end up cutting off the sap supply to the rest of the tree because they eat all of that material is how the sap
Yes. Yes.
travels.
Mhm.
And so eventually the tree just dies. And the thing is this beetle is not native to the United States. It was only first observed near Detroit in 2002. So, relatively recently. But in just this little amount of time, it has killed tens of millions of ash trees in this continent. And
That's really sad, yeah.
Some estimates I've read is that they predict that basically in like 20 years, there will be no ash trees anymore.
Yeah.
Which is kind of mind-blowing to think about. This beetle, they suspect was probably accidentally brought to the United States in wooden pallets in shipping. So
it's too bad.
And so, it was coming probably from somewhere in East Asia, and somebody somewhere made pallets for who knows what product was being imported, but just inside the wood, the ash wood they use for the pallet, this beetle was able to sneak in, and now it's everywhere. One thing I found very interesting is like, well, why does this beetle destroying ash trees in the North American continent, but not where it's from, and also not in Europe?
Okay, because I just was wondering if it's not. Did you say it was the bark beetle? No.
So bark beetle's a different one.
Yeah.
Bark
Okay.
beetle,
Yeah.
And that's a big problem in Europe, and
Exactly,
also we have some issue here too.
But I was just wondering. Yeah, we've been having a lot of problems with the bark beetle.
Yeah, and it's a similar kind of pest, but the ash borer, the bark beetle, I think, is mostly on spruce and pine. But the emerald ash borer only attacks ash trees. But in its native range, it's not a problem. It just lives there, and from what I've read, there might be some places in Europe where it could be a little bit of a problem. For the most part, it's not on the ash trees in Europe.
Yeah,
and that is apparently because ash trees, particularly white ash and green ash, in over here, they are very lacking in tannins. So tannins are these bitter compounds. When you drink wine, the tannins in wine are coming from the oak barrels that wine ages in.
All right.
And they're these bitter compounds. And those compounds are not as tasty to the ash borer, and I guess it slows it down, its activity in its native range. And the ash trees in the native range of the borer are high in tannins, and the ones in Europe are high in tannins, but apparently like the white ash, for example, and the green ash too, I think, have virtually no tannins. And so that's why the beetle can attack it so strongly. One little thing I found pretty interesting was that one of the kind of like side effects of this tree going away is that in the areas where there's a lot of ash tree tadpoles, so small frogs. What's the word for that in German? Like the little frogs that are just like a little swimming tail.
Yeah, it's a really weird word. I don't know if you want to hear it. It's Qualquappen.
Oh. Qualquappen. No, that's a good one.
Yes, it's a kind of weird word.
Tadpole is almost a weirder word.
Yeah, it's kind of weird word.
But they eat when the ash leaves fall into the water in a swamp. The tadpoles eat the ash leaves because they are low in the tannins. So other trees, like for example maples, have more, and oaks have more tannins, and so they're not as nutritious to these little tadpoles. So as the ash dies and other trees take over, it's also damaging the tadpoles' environment. So kind of these interesting ripple effects.
Absolutely, yeah.
One of the reasons why this, I think, has been so prolific as well, including that the fact that the ash tree here doesn't have these tannins, is that also in a lot of urban areas all over this part of the world, ash trees were planted in essentially a monoculture in neighborhoods because they look beautiful. So you'd have whole streets with ashes.
They are beautiful trees. Yeah.
And so in these urban areas, they planned them, and they planted tons of them. So you'll look down, there's some really great pictures of these, look down this long little suburban neighborhood, and it's all ash trees. Well, that's a bit of a problem because the borer can spread from tree to tree to tree to tree.
Oh yeah, it's easy
makes the issue more damaging. One thing I read, which was an interesting analysis of human activity, is that there's another plant disease called Dutch elm disease that caused a lot of problem with elm trees in the United States back, in the 50s, I think. And it was the same thing where there was these neighborhoods where they planted all these elm trees, and then Dutch elm came through and killed them all. And then later they just replaced the elm with ash.
Yeah.
Ash is being all destroyed. Which, what I talked about earlier is if you are in a forest around here, they're a mixed hardwood forest. These hardwoods don't tend to live in these monocultures, right? It's
not a natural thing for them, yeah.
Right. right? They're meant to be spread around. So that's part of the problem before. So I talked a little bit about there is some hope, so I'm going to get to that. the, there's kind of well, there's three pieces of hope. One is there are some treatments for this now. So you can, if you find a tree that has it, there are now quarantine protocols in place to try to keep it from affecting other trees. It can trees, if they're caught at the right time and done correctly, they can also be treated with an insecticide, which is one of those things that's like you got to balance the good with the bad. But if you time it right, you can apparently stop the beetle and still save the tree. And then they're also exploring, which this is also maybe controversial, and hopefully it's not one of those other opening a Pandora's box, but they're exploring native predators from the original ash borer's home. So there's several wasps that prey on the ash borer. They're experimenting with importing those to try to like limit the ash borer, which is like, well, you're importing another non-native species. Are we going to have like a ripple effect? But from what I've read, they have seemed to see that these wasps are not causing any other issues, at least in the few areas where they're trying this. But I think what is the better hope is that there is a something that scientists now are calling the lingering ash. And there are these cases where all the ash trees in an area have been destroyed, except for there's a couple that have survived.
That's interesting.
And there was a really interesting situation where this professor in the 70s, a guy named Professor Steiner at Penn State, he planted a plantation of ash trees in the 70s before ash borer. And he was doing science about what happens if you take seeds of the same kind of tree and move them to areas outside of their native range. And he was doing a test to see like, well, the trees if I plant seeds from this area over here and this over here and this area over here, I plant them all in the same place, which ones are going to do better?
Yes. Yeah.
So he planted 2,100 ash trees in this plantation in Pennsylvania. And it inadvertently became an experiment about ash borer. Because they didn't exist at the time, but now there's 2,100 ash trees all in this one area. And when ash borer came in, it killed 95% of them.
Oh, wow.
But there are 15 trees with no damage.
That didn't die.
And so now what they're trying to look into is what are the genetics of those trees that's making them successful, and can they propagate those trees and use those trees as the way to save the ash species?
Yes.
So I thought that was really interesting. You know, it is a really depressing story to be like, oh my gosh, these trees are going to be gone, and it's something in our lifetime.
Yes, yeah.
But there is this interesting hope, and the one thing that it makes me think about, and I say this to friends all the time, and there's probably some like philosopher who's talked about this more eloquently than me, but there's this concept of like, for most of human history, you could make a decision as a human, and if it was a bad decision, worst case scenario, you like destroyed a village, right? You probably just end up destroying yourself. You know, you're experimenting with something in caveman days, and you like.
But it was in a small sobriety. It was like, it wasn't like
right. But now this, an ash borer is a perfect example of this. Just the fact that some people somewhere decided to import some random product to the U.S. And didn't realize there's this little bug in that wood, and now we are faced with potential extinction of a species. And it's incredible. It's this problem of how do we make decisions today?
Yes, yeah.
When we can inadvertently cause such this disaster. Such a simple decision can have a worldwide impact, and it's something I think about a lot, and how we move forward. And anyway, that's where I am with ash. I'm hoping that these lingering ash trees can save it, because it will be really a bummer to not have this tree.
No, that is thanks for sharing that. I think that's super interesting, and brings up the whole subject of I think a lot of people come kind of back to the equation that maybe the natural balance, the way things were, was the best way maybe that things were able to thrive. And then if it's out of balance, things get really complicated, because you're always trying to stop a wildfire, and then there's another one.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's interesting to listen to, because I've noticed when I go for walks in the forest here, I've seen that so many spruce trees are having a lot of trouble and have been dying.
Mm.
And I don't know exactly the reasons now for this, but I Googled it when I got home a couple of weeks ago, and there's a problem here with the spruce trees. And
Oh, very interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah.
interesting to look into that. I know the ash trees, and I don't. Yeah, like you said, I don't see that there's the same thing happening here. Like you said at the beginning, it's a different story here. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's my story, and sorry to share such a maybe a bummer of a story, but
It's
I wanted to share.
good to know about these things. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
It's sad, but it's good to be aware of these things. And yeah,
Cool. Well, thanks for joining me today.
thanks so much, Steve, for having me. Yeah, I enjoyed that a lot.
If you go walking in the woods in the eastern part of this continent, you are likely to come across an ash tree that has been recently destroyed by emerald ash borers. Seeing these trees, dead but still standing, is like seeing a ghost. This song is called Ghosts, and it is by Timothy Yarmir, our guest on this episode of Rootbound.
Cause you can, you won't, and you don't stop living a dream that you made up, and now you're filling it up with silence and heartache. But the patterns appear from the outside like stones along the wayside, reminding you of the high tide and danger. Cause you can and you won't, and you don't stop living a dream that you made up, and now you're filling it up with silence and heartache. But the patterns appear from the outside like stones along the wayside, reminding you of the high tide and danger.
This song, Ghosts, is from Timothy Yarmir's album entitled Hireth. Hireth is a Welsh word that is very poignant and I think is also evocative of the ash tree. The definition of Hireth is apparently difficult to translate into English, but it means something like a homesickness tinged with grief and sadness over the lost or departed. It is a mixture of longing, yearning, nostalgia, and wistfulness. My guest on this episode of Rootbound was Timothy Yarmir, a singer-songwriter based in Switzerland. You can listen to more of Timothy Yarmir's music at timothyyarmir.com. That is Timothy, the way it's normally spelled, and then Yarmir, which is Jaromir.com. He is also one half of the excellent musical duo Gold Shots, which you can listen to Gold Shots at goldshotsmusic.com. That's Gold Shots, which is SCHATZ, music.com. Rootbound is hosted by Steve Ellington. That is me. Music by Christian Kriegescota. Fake ads by David Lonnie. Rootbound is a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside, but if you can go outside, visit an ash tree while you still can.
Kind of a big dill.